A hole in the ground, one seedling, and a family tree that hasn't been born yet, standing under its shade in the year 2326. That's the actual math behind this video, because 10 trees exist that you plant exactly once, and your great-great-great-grandchildren will still be eating off them. Nurseries don't want you to know this list. A dwarf apple tree from the garden center dies at 15 years and needs replacing. A tree that lives 300 years only sells once. There's a pear tree still fruiting in Endicott, New York, planted in 1647. Number 3 on this list, I'll get there. This isn't permaculture cosplay. I'm not telling you to abandon your yard for a food forest. I'm telling you 10 species exist right now at your local extension office that outlive the concept of a mortgage. Here's who benefits from you not knowing this. The nursery industry runs on repeat customers. A 2020 trade report from the American Nursery and Landscape Association put average tree replacement purchases at once every 12 to 18 years for the average homeowner. That's not an accident. That's the business model. And the thing that gets me is none of this was hidden. It's sitting in university extension bulletins that get about 40 views a year. Do the math on it. A dwarf apple tree runs about $35 at most garden centers and needs replacing roughly every 15 years. Over a 300-year span, at today's prices, that's 20 separate trees and something like $700, not counting labor, not counting the decade you lose each time waiting for a new one to mature. One olive sapling, planted once, for about $60. You've been told fruit and nut trees are a short-term project. Plant it, get a decade or two of harvests, pull the stump, start over. That's true for the trees sold at big box stores. It is not true for the species that were actually being planted before the nursery industry existed. Here's the flip. There's an olive tree on the Greek island of Crete in the village of Arnovouves that's been radiocarbon and ring dated to somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years old. And it's still producing olives every single season. Not surviving, producing. A tree planted before the Parthenon was finished is still making dinner. None of this is new information, and that's the part that should actually bother you. Chestnut orchards fed entire regions of Appalachia for close to 300 years, until a fungal blight imported on Japanese nursery stock around 1904 wiped out almost 4 billion American chestnuts in 4 decades. The trees that survived that blight, the resistant ones, are exactly the ones nobody's replanting at scale. The Cherokee were managing bur oak groves in the Ohio Valley, specifically for acorn harvests, centuries before European settlement, according to ethnobotanical records compiled by the Ohio Historical Society. Whole villages ran on a food source that regenerates itself every autumn, without anyone planting anything twice. Same pattern in the Mediterranean. Roman agricultural writer Columella was giving instructions on olive grove management in the 1st century AD, and some of the groves his contemporaries planted in southern Spain are still being harvested by families whose surnames show up in tax records from the same region 1,500 years later. Okay, 10 trees in order, shortest, live to the ones that outlast civilizations. Hazelnut. On paper, the tree itself lives 40 to 80 years, which sounds like the weak link on this list. Except hazelnut coppices, meaning you cut it back to the base and it regrows from the same root system indefinitely. There are coppiced hazel stands in the Chiltern Hills of England, still producing off-root systems planted in the 1600s. Same roots. New trunks every generation. American persimmon lives 75 to 100 years above ground, but wild persimmon groves in the Ozarks send up root suckers that keep the genetic line producing for well over 2 centuries in the same hollow. Figure, the trunk itself rarely tops 100 years, but a fig tree cut to the ground resprouts from the root crown almost every time. There are fig trees in Italian farmyards, documented back to the 1800s, that have been cut down and regrown 4 or 5 separate times and never stopped fruiting for more than a season. Common pear. That 1647 Endicott pear tree is real, it's still alive, and it's outlived the Dutch colony that planted it, the American Revolution, and roughly 11 generations of the family that owns the land under it. Black walnut lives 130 to 250 years, and a single mature tree can drop 50 to 100 pounds of nuts a season once it hits maturity around year 20, which means one tree planted by a grandparent is still feeding a family the day the grandchildren retire. European mulberry. There's a black mulberry tree at Syon Park in London, planted around 1548, still fruiting after nearly 500 years, and mulberries produce so heavily that a single mature tree can bury a driveway in fruit for 6 weeks straight every summer. Silkworm farmers in England planted thousands of these in the 1600s, trying to compete with Chinese silk production, and most of the silk industry failed within a generation. The trees they planted are still standing and still fruiting long after anyone remembers why they were planted. Bur oak lives 300 to 400 years and drops acorns that, once leached of tannins in running water for 2 to 3 days, grind into a flour that's been a staple starch on this continent for over 8,000 years, according to archaeological starch residue studies out of the University of Illinois. American chestnut, or its blight-resistant hybrids, now being planted by the American Chestnut Foundation, historically lived 400 to 600 years and produced nuts so reliably that 19th century Appalachian families paid their taxes with the harvest. Pecan. There's a native pecan tree standing in San Saba County, Texas, that local land records place at over 1,000 years old, and it's still dropping nuts every fall. San Saba calls itself the pecan capital of the world, partly because of trees exactly like that one, planted before any county lines existed to claim credit for them. Olive closes the list because nothing else on it comes close. 2,000 years, sometimes 4, on the same root system in the same soil, feeding whoever happens to be alive at the time. Here's where people mess it up. Grafted fruit trees from most nurseries are grafted onto dwarf rootstock, specifically to make them fruit faster and stay small for suburban yards. And that rootstock is exactly what caps the lifespan at 15 to 25 years. If you want the 300-year version, you have to specifically ask for standard rootstock, not dwarf or semi-dwarf, and most garden center employees won't know the difference unless you ask by name. And chestnuts specifically need 2 trees for pollination, not 1. Plant a single tree expecting a harvest, and you'll wait years for nuts that were never coming, because chestnuts are self-incompatible and need a second genetically distinct tree within about 200 feet, somewhere between a 4,000-year-old olive tree in Crete and a dwarf apple tree that dies before your kid finishes high school. We decided food had to be replaced every decade to count as normal. It doesn't. It never did. Plant the tree that outlives you on purpose and let the argument about whether that's excessive be settled by whoever's still eating off it 3 centuries from now. Somebody 300 years from now is going to inherit a piece of land. The only question is whether there's anything on it worth keeping.